agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my, not conservative counterpart, Chase Law School professor Ken Katkin. Hey, Ken.
Hey, Michael. It's great to be back.
Yeah, I think listeners were probably expecting a Trey and Ken show, and that was going to be the case up until actually a little less than 24 hours ago. But as listeners know, Trey has been fighting for a number of years now at this point, some very significant autoimmune issues, and things took a little bit of a turn for the worse, unfortunately. And so Trey was not able to make it for the show today. So I am jumping in here at the last minute. And Trey, if you're listening, of course, our prayers, thoughts for a speedy recovery and getting you back to better shape, certainly with you, and hang in there, my friend. All right, so we do have an awful lot to cover today, Ken, and such as, there's a breaking news story we'll get to in just a minute, and some thoughts on the midterms and looking forward to 2024 because, Donald Trump's kind of forcing the issue on us. Some legislation that's actually making its way through Congress on a bipartisan basis. Yes, it does still happen. Joe Biden's talks with China's president and a whole bunch of stuff, really, and we will get started on that in just 1 second. Okay, Ken, so before we get started, you alerted me, actually, we're recording this on early Friday afternoon, and you alerted me to a breaking news story that we haven't really had enough time to think about, and that's still actually kind of ongoing, but I thought we could maybe talk about it at least just for a few minutes for our initial impression. So why don't you kind of bring us up to speed, at least as to what we know right now with this story?
Yeah, so several news outlets, including the Wall Street Journal and Politico, are just starting to report that Attorney General Merrick Garland is going to be having a press conference this afternoon at which he is going to announce that he's appointing a special prosecutor to oversee criminal matters related to President Donald Trump. And the Politico report gets a little more specific and says that the two crimes that are being referred to the special prosecutor, one is the retention of sensitive national security secrets at Mar-a-Lago, and the other are the efforts by Trump and his allies to subvert the 2020 election. So those are apparently the two matters that some media sources right now are expecting will be referred to a special prosecutor in an hour or two.
And of course, we don't know who that prosecutor will be and any of the details, but I think maybe we can talk at least for a minute or two about what we think about the idea of a special prosecutor as opposed to this just being done sort of in-house. And I'm sure you have some just general thoughts on that, right, Ken?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm generally against it. I think I could be persuaded because I'm really just trying to think it through. But I think the concept of a special prosecutor generally would relate to the concerns about conflicts of interest within the Justice Department. So that, since the Justice Department is part of the president's administration, that if there needs to be an investigation of the president or someone in his administration, you might need a special counsel. I don't really see why one would be needed for an investigation of Donald Trump, who is not the boss of anyone who works in the Justice Department. And I do have some concerns that this is going to just introduce even more delay. These investigations have been proceeding deliberatively but slowly. And I don't think that there's a great benefit to introducing anything that's going to slow down the forward movement of them anymore, as it seems to me that a handoff would do. But those are kind of my tentative initial thoughts. What are yours, Michael?
I'm torn because I get your argument, and I think it seems to be the logical argument is that that's what a special prosecutor is designed for when there are clear and obvious conflicts of interest. But the reason I'm torn is that there are certainly perceived conflicts of interest. And then some might say, they're perceived because Donald Trump and other folks have done a whole lot to make this argument that the Justice Department is completely in the pocket and biased and so forth. And so you don't want to necessarily give credence to those arguments because you kind of open the door and, God knows where that leads. And so I guess I appreciate that. It seems to me that appointing a special prosecutor might be the smarter short-term political move. But in terms of what it suggests longer terms, and as for the legitimacy of the Justice Department, the perceived legitimacy, well, I have some concerns about that. So I'm going to need to know more, I guess, but I'm probably leaning a little bit the other way from where you are because of those kind of shorter term political concerns, I guess.
Yeah, although the legitimacy issue cuts both ways, because the idea that that this would need to be given to a special counsel, I think plays into some theories. I'd say conspiracy theories that the Justice Department is partisan and is pursuing a political agenda, and therefore there'd be some need to take it out of the hands of the ordinary civil servants there. And so I don't really see much reason to validate that kind of conspiracy thinking. Also, I would just say in history, although the very first special prosecutor that President Nixon appointed to investigate himself, Archibald Cox, was a Democrat appointed to investigate a Republican. Nixon fired him fairly quickly in the Saturday Night Massacre. And the one kind of iron rule of special prosecutors ever since then seems to be that no matter who's being investigated, whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president, the special prosecutor must be a Republican always, or else all the Republicans are going to scream bias. And I feel like that's a narrative that needs to be chopped off. We've basically never had any special prosecutors since Cox who weren't Republicans, no matter who was being investigated. And I feel like if that's the narrative now, well, Garland can't investigate Trump because Garland's a Democrat. Why was it okay then for Mueller to investigate Trump when Mueller was a Republican, just like Trump was?
Yeah, I wasn't aware of the fact that they've all been Republicans. Of course, it's probably a very small N, so I'm not sure how much weight I'm going to give to that. But I see your point. I think there's definitely more suspicion on the right, and playing into that the short-term argument, I'm sure, is that, well, if we can get a Republican who is someone who's respected by Republicans to make a case, that's going to have a lot more legitimacy in the eyes of a lot of other maybe moderate Republicans than it would be if we found, a lifelong Democrat to do that. And that's the political argument that I think has some merit. But again, and this is why I'm torn and not coming down directly on one side, because I think, you make some pretty important points there as well.
Yeah, I don't think too many Republicans credited the Mueller report because Mueller was a Republican, but Mueller was picked because he was a Republican. I just think that the idea that the idea that any Trumpers are going to accept the legitimacy of an indictment of Trump, because it comes from a Republican, I don't buy that at all.
No.
I think that So I think the question isn't about what the Trumpers are going to accept. The question is about whether the Justice Department is going to keep buying into this narrative that because Republicans scream and scream and scream about political bias, that every investigation of every president and every investigation of every former president can only be done by Republicans ever. I don't think it's helpful to give life to that narrative.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a good point. But I also think there are the kind of diehard election deniers, red hat wearing, trucker hat wearing MAGA Republicans who, you're right. Matt Gaetz could get up there and start yelling about Trump being guilty and they wouldn't buy into that sort of thing. But I also think that there's a not insignificant number of Republicans who are hearing that from their right flank and saying, yeah, I don't know, maybe there's something to that, who are convincible. And so I think that that's where this is being directed toward. And that's why, again, I think that this is maybe not a bad move by Garland, who I think is not only a straight shooter, but also a very politically savvy guy.
I'm not going to say it's a terrible move, and I agree there could be some short-term political benefits from it. But I want to see, who the special counsel is, and I also want to see how much that special counsel inherits the civil servants in the Justice Department who've already been working this matter for a couple of years, because I think it's important not to have this be something that introduces any significant delay.
Yeah, no, that seems reasonable. Yeah. So, and of course, we will have more on this in weeks to come, because this will not be a short-term thing. So stay tuned for that. But let's move on from that into, well, the 2022 midterms. The results are almost all in. And of course, Republicans generally disappointed with their underwhelming showing, both in Congress and at the state level. But we do know now that the Republicans will have a very narrow majority in the House, at least in the 118th Congress. And last week, Jay and I talked about kind of our overall impressions, including the lessons that we felt each party should take away from what happened. And Ken, I thought maybe we could start there today with your overall thoughts, because they might be a little bit different from what I took away from that. So what looking back on these kind of in total, now that we more or less know the parameters of what happened, what do you take away from this?
Well, first, I want to start by taking the politics guy's victory lap and say my predictions were better than any of the rest of you guys. I predicted 50 or 51 Dems in the Senate,
there you go.
And I predicted that the Republicans would be ahead by 2 or 3 seats. And I think those are both basically right. The only minor part of my prediction that I got wrong, and I'll acknowledge it, is I thought that, although I thought the Republicans would take the House narrowly, and they did, I thought that would be entirely because of gerrymandering, and that the Dems would easily win the national popular vote in the House. That didn't happen. The Republicans won the national popular vote in the House by about the same percentage that they won the seats in the House. So I will have to say that a lot of my concerns about gerrymandering didn't play out exactly as I expected, but the numbers did play out exactly as I expected. So,
gotcha. So, victory, but not total and complete victory for Ken Katkin. Yeah, that's what we're saying.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. But and in terms of the lessons to be learned, I think the country is really kind of calcifying in its political views, and so that when you look at history and you look at the traditional bigger swings in a midterm election, I think that's a thing of the past, because not only because of the gerrymandering and because of the sorting out of people into red states and blue states, which is pretty impervious to short-term change, but also I think just because the number of swing voters, the number of voters who could potentially vote for Republicans or Democrats, there's still some, and in this election that some swinging did determine some outcomes. But it's just less than ever, and I think that means it's going to be smaller numbers of shifts than ever based on those kind of voters, and that elections are going to be much, much, much more about turnout than about persuasion, I suppose.
Yeah, that sounds right to me as well, definitely. Any other general thoughts? I mean, one concern that I mentioned last week was that I certainly hope that the Democrats don't look at this election and say, well, I guess we're more or less on the right track, because I think that is a dangerous message to take away. There was a Republican consultant who, after the midterm, said something to the effect of, well, the public decided that our crazy is a little less acceptable than their crazy. And I don't know if I would have put it exactly that way, but I kind of get what he was saying, and I think he's onto something there.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with that. I think the Democrats, it's hard for me to concretely say what policies are you talking about. I'm pretty in sync with the policies of the current Democratic Congress. And, to say that they're on the wrong track, I guess I'd want more specifics about what policies would you change.
Yeah, I think in general, it's referring to the policies based on diversity, what they call the wokeism sort of stuff, and feeling that the Democratic Party is much more aligned with college-educated elites as opposed to kind of the traditional Democratic working class, high school-educated base, what used to be base of the Republican Party that's not, or Democratic Party that's more and more affiliated with Republicans.
Yeah, so I think two things I'd say about that. They might go a little contrary to each other, but I work in a university. In fact, I work in the same university that you do,
yep.
and I get concerned sometimes about the wokeism too in contexts like that. I'm not all about that kind of thing, and I think in higher ed, I think oftentimes the whole DEI thing, goes too far. However, I don't think that at all about the policies of the Democrats in the United States Congress. And I think what you're really seeing there is not that the Democratic Congress has pursued any policies that don't involve, simple things like protecting the civil rights of African Americans to be allowed to vote or to not be killed too frequently by police officers for no reason. I hope everybody would support those kind of policies. And the idea that that the Democratic caucus in the Congress is going way beyond that and is going to some kind of extreme wokeism, I think that's purely a Republican propaganda. It has no basis in reality, and therefore there's nothing that the Dems could do in terms of changing their policies to counteract that. And it's really just something that has to be fought on the communications level, not on the policy level.
Do you think that, I think that there's a lot to that argument. Do you think that it works the other way, that Republicans are right in saying that, hey, we're not mostly Marjorie Taylor Greene and that sort of thing, and so characterizing the party that way, it's being sort of unfair to what real Republican policies are, and we're not against, cutting and running in Ukraine. We're not against, we're not for, the kind of these sort of things that these extremists on the right are for, though some of them happen to be in Congress.
No, I don't think it's symmetric like that at all, because I'll use the examples of the suburban districts in New York that flipped, right? So in New York, you had one of the seats was Sean Patrick Maloney's seat. So he was, in fact, the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. His seat is in Westchester County and goes, I think, even a little further north up towards Hudson, New York. So suburban New York City. And there was another seat on Long Island in suburban New York City. And I think these, by Republican standards, the Republicans who won those seats would be probably relatively moderate Republicans. That's not the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the party, who could never possibly win in suburban New York City. But yet, the main issue that they won on was totally falsely demagoguing that that crime is going way up in New York City, and that all of that is because of defund the police. Now, that kind of thing has no bearing in reality. Crime's not going up in New York City any faster than it's going up anywhere else. And the opposite of defund the police, New York City's mayor is an extremely pro-police mayor. And there's no policies that happened in New York City that were in any way anti-police. And crime hasn't really, crime's gone up there a little, but it's gone up everywhere a little. And so, sort of creating this idea, well, Democrats are all into wokeism, and if you allow those kind of people to run things, there's going to be chaos and disorder and crime. It's a totally false narrative, but it was the one that the moderate Republicans ran on in suburban New York, and it was the one that took them to victory.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I don't know that it's I would call it mischaracterization, perhaps exaggeration, but not necessarily a totally false narrative. The story I hear from a lot of folks on the right is, well, you take a look at the cities with the most crime, they tend to be what they call Democrat cities, right? And now that may be true, but it's true
It isn't true, Michael. It isn't true. It isn't true. New York City's crime rate is so much lower than Oklahoma City's crime rate.
Well, I'm just pulling up a list here of most dangerous cities, violent crimes per 1,000 person in the first half of 2022. And okay, the first two, Little Rock and Memphis, and then Tacoma, Detroit, Pueblo, Cleveland, my hometown, Springfield, Lansing, Kansas City, and Chattanooga are the top 10. Now, I'm not positive on what the city governments are there, certainly, but there's I would guess that's probably a majority of them. Well, I guess what I'm saying is that a
lot of that's in red states.
A lot of it, I think, are blue cities in red states, because you're going to have more crime. My point is you're going to have more crime, other things being equal, in urban areas, not because they're controlled by Democrats, but for other reasons. And so this just is I won't call it a coincidence. It's a correlation, but not a causal relationship. And a lot of folks on the right are saying, no, it's actually a causal relationship, when I would say, I don't think the evidence is there to make that case, at least convincingly in my mind. That's my point.
Yeah, I agree with that. But if you take it back to the politics of it, what could a Democrat possibly do then? I mean, if the way you're looking at this is, well, Democrats tend to be in power in urban areas, and urban areas for other reasons have more crime, and therefore it's going to be relatively easy for Republicans to tar Democratic politicians with the brush of crime. Well, even on your accounting of it, none of that has to do with Democratic policies. So how could Democratic policies be changed to address that?
Yeah, and that's the part where I say is not fair at all, because maybe there are policies that could change that, but even if there were, they would likely be at the city and the state level and not necessarily at the congressional level. So yeah, that's the part where there is a disconnect, but most people don't know enough about how politics actually works kind of at that ground level, or not enough people know to make that connection. And so that's what's taken advantage of, certainly. So, yeah, in that sense, I agree.
Yeah. And that takes us back to my question back to you. You were saying you think the Dems need to move away from some kind of wokeism or something. And, again, I'm kind of challenging you, what could they move away from? What policy are they pursuing that you think is either wrong on the merits, or even if it's right on the merits, is harming them politically? Like, what actual policies?
Yeah, and I guess I would say that it's not really anything that the mainstream congressional Democrats have introduced. Nothing I can think of that has any kind of realistic chance of passing at any point. But of course, there are those folks on the extremes. And then the question becomes, I think, well, can you distance yourself from those folks on the extremes if you're, say, a centrist Democrat like I am, in a way that's both convincing enough to maybe the small number of undecided or potential swing voters, without actually kind of doing a disservice to your very real commitments to what I would call non-woke social justice. And that's a difficult thing to do, And so, for instance, while I think that AOC is kind of way to the left of me on a lot of things, I think there's a kernel of value in almost everything she's talking about, and trying to make those fine distinctions to voters who are necessarily not going to be enmeshed in politics in the same way that, say, you or I are. That's a really tough messaging challenge. And so on that, and you mentioned that, and I certainly agree that it is a big messaging problem for Democrats.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't see. I think messaging is always something that politicians are going to have to think about a lot, but I just don't see. I don't really recommend any kind of policy changes to the Dems. I don't think they need to have a rethinking of, we're pursuing policies that the public doesn't like, so we better change gears. I think that would not be helpful for them, I guess is what I'm saying.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about some changes that we're going to see in the next Congress and what we think about them. And I think the biggest thing, at least on the House side, is that sort of the old guard, literally the old guard, is mostly going to be out of power. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi said she's not going to seek re-election to a leadership role in the next Congress, and she's led the Democrats since 2003, so almost 2 decades. Her number 2, Steny Hoyer, he's 82. He said he's also not going to be seeking a leadership position, and so the last of that kind of big 3, Jim Clyburn, he's also 82. He does plan on still staying in the leadership. It looks like he has the support to do that, but the number 4 spot of assistant leader. And this really opens the door for kind of a new generation of Democratic leadership in the House. And it looks right now that like Hakeem Jeffries is going to be kind of the consensus pick to lead the House Democrats. He's 52, which is, young enough to be maybe not quite Pelosi's grandson, but certainly his kid. And if he's elected, he's going to be the first black person to lead a political party in Congress, which is not nothing. And also, he's only been in Congress since 2013. So that's a pretty impressively quick rise from not even being a member to all of a sudden leading a party in Congress. So what do you think about the leadership shakeup in the House?
Well, I am a huge admirer of Nancy Pelosi, and she will be a tough act to follow. But it was necessary. I mean, you can't keep going with octogenarians forever. There has to be a generational shift, and this is the right time for it. The Dems did lose the majority, so it's the right time for a shift. And it looks to me like they're going to perfectly good people to be in the leadership. I could think of other people I would have also been happy to see in the leadership, but the names I'm hearing seem, completely fine to me. So I think it's a good move.
Yeah, and I agree, but there's some resistance from the left wing of the party, feeling like, well, Jeffries is another one of those kind of Wall Street, big money, centrist Democrats, and we're not going to really shake things up in a big way, that sort of thing. And I understand the arguments, but I think that that's a losing political argument, because for the Democrats to be able to build any sort of a majority in 2024 or beyond, those are exactly the kind of districts they're going to need to win back. And so a more kind of far left leadership is not going to be, I don't think, the sort of leadership to do that.
Right. And I mean, just to add to that point, one thing that Pelosi and Biden were very effective at, in my view, is they had good open communications with the left wing of the party, and they incorporated a lot of policy ideas from the left wing of the party. And I think good leaders can do that even while they're positioning themselves as centrists. So I have no doubts that Hakeem Jeffries will be able to do that as well.
Yeah, I would expect so, too. And then, of course, on the House side, Kevin McCarthy, everyone sort of expected him to become the next speaker. Looks like that's going to be the case, though he did have to win a leadership vote over the former House Freedom Caucus chair, Andy Biggs. And that wasn't close, but the fact that there was some opposition, what do you take anything away from that? And also, I guess, what's your take on sort of the challenges that face Kevin McCarthy with just a razor thin, it could just be a 3-seat majority or so, Republican majority in the 118th Congress?
Yeah, well, it's a similar thin majority to what Nancy Pelosi had to work with, and she was extremely effective at holding her caucus together. I will say I think Kevin McCarthy is no Nancy Pelosi, and I think he will have a much harder time holding his caucus together. Not only because he's a weaker person, which I think he is, but also because I think very many members of his caucus don't have any legislative agenda they want to advance anyhow. They really just want to focus totally on investigations and not get anything actually done. And so, they don't even have that incentive to try to work with him to maintain party discipline to get things done. And that's only compounded by the fact that, of course, they don't control the Senate or the White House. So, even if they maintained a ton of discipline and kept all the Republicans together and passed bills that advanced a conservative agenda, those bills are not going to be taken up in the Senate or sent to the White House. And if they were, they'd be vetoed in the White House. So I think, we're really looking at a kind of a 2-year clown show with lots and lots of investigations and not much else happening. And certainly government shutdowns and probably impeachment votes. And I would also think we're going to see the first time in American history where, beyond just threatening not to raise the debt ceiling, my sense is that will actually happen this time, and that the U.S. will start defaulting on U.S. bonds and things like that for the first time.
I hope you're wrong about that. I know you're right about the investigations. I mean, Jim Jordan and I'm blanking on the other guy have already announced that they're gearing up the works to an investigation of, well, it's not exactly going to be a Hunter Biden investigation. They've said we're focusing on that. Basically, it's not a question of whether or not Hunter Biden's a bad guy. He is. We're focusing on what the president knew and when he knew it, that sort of thing. So absolutely, that's going to happen. I'll also, though, point out that I think there's potentially a big difference between working with a majority of 7 or 8, which is what the Democrats have typically had, depending on vacancies at the time, and the majority of what looks like it might be 3 or 4, right? And you have Thomas Massey coming out and saying, hey, if this is the case, I could perhaps be a caucus of 1, and I'll be able to stop all kinds of stuff and get my way, and that makes it a lot tougher. So the wiggle room is not just minimal; it's almost none. And you're right, the fact that everyone knows that there's no serious legislative proposal that House Republicans are going to be able to pass that will actually become law kind of gives them license, if you will, to kind of be more out there, certainly. And I expect it to be pretty rough, certainly, especially with, like, coming right out of the gate, the Hunter Biden investigation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in fact, the only mysteries, I suppose, to me, are going to be things like, clearly most of those House Republicans are just chomping at the bit to vote out articles of impeachment against Biden, maybe even against Fauci and people like that. But I don't I predict that they will not be able to hold their majorities together for that because, for instance, I was talking a minute ago about those suburban New York City districts. That would be an extremely toxic vote for those guys.
Yeah.
Right. There, you only need to have, 5 Republicans who are, elected from blue states and who really, can't really cast that impeachment vote. That's all it's going to take to actually make it impossible for them to get that impeachment vote.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's right, actually. So, well, let's look at the Senate side. We haven't talked about them yet because on the Senate side, things will remain just about the same. The Democrats might actually end up picking up one seat. We'll see what happens in Georgia. Mitch McConnell, for the first time in 15 years, actually was faced with a challenge for Republican minority leadership. Rick Scott challenged him, and in the vote, this is a private vote, but these things leak like sieves. We were told McConnell got 37 votes to Scott's 10. And, Scott has been very critical of how McConnell has managed the Republican Party. But McConnell, in turn, has questioned how Scott has done his job as head of the National Republican Senatorial Committee after some pretty clearly disappointing results for Senate Republicans. So do you read anything into that challenge to McConnell's leadership in the Senate, how that might change things at all?
I think it was purely performative. I don't think there was ever a minute when anyone, including Scott or McConnell, thought there was any chance that this challenge was anything other than theater. But I think what Scott was trying to do was to signal to Trump and to the Trump loyalists, that he's one of them. Yeah. I think that's the only thing that was about at all. Yeah, I agree. I have heard you agree with that. I have heard people in Kentucky talking about. I don't really believe this, but I've heard people in Kentucky saying that they think McConnell might not finish out his term, that he might retire before the end of his term. Now that it's clear that even though he's still the minority leader, he's never going to be the majority leader again. I don't really buy that either. I think there's a lot of Kentucky Republicans don't love McConnell and think that they get someone like Massey in there and they're very excited about that. But I don't, I think he will ride out his term. He will be the minority leader the whole time. One thing I do want to say about the Georgia election, you and I think, both predicted that Warnock's more likely to hang on, and I stand by that for sure. I think one thing that I haven't heard talked about enough in other reporting is, why would it matter whether they get 50 or 51? A lot of people are saying it probably doesn't matter that much because 50 is already a majority as long as Kamala Harris can break a tie. But I think one thing that's extremely significant about it is it changes the procedures needed for committees to issue subpoenas, right? Because all of the committees are evenly divided in a 50-50 Senate. So any standing committee with subpoena power, there's going to be a deadlock vote in many cases. If the Senate wanted to do anything like investigate January 6th or Trump or something like that, it would be hard for something like the Senate Judiciary Committee to do that because the Judiciary Committee itself could not issue a subpoena on a divided vote. And there's mechanisms where they could then send that request up to the full floor, but that's not something that's going to be used every day to run a routine kind of oversight investigation. So a 51-49 gives the Dems one more vote on every committee than the Republicans will have.
Oh, it's an interesting point. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, so that opens up a world of opportunities. The Senate's obviously not going to run something like the January 6th committee that the House was running, because the Senate has to run on a much more bipartisan basis. But the Senate could pick up the January 6th investigation if you had a 51-49 Senate and just run it through the ordinary Senate Judiciary Committee. And all the Republicans on that committee would have their role. They'd be able to bring in their witnesses. They'd be able to question the witnesses. But the key thing is that now the Dems would have the subpoena power to keep that going, which they couldn't have done in the last Congress. So I think that's the most significant difference. I still think with both Sinema and Manchin being in there, it's going to be, still difficult to pass a lot of legislation, whether it's 50 or 51.
It wouldn't matter because with the House and Republican control, but it does give the Biden administration maybe a little more wiggle room with some nominations, I would think, as well, potentially.
Yeah, I think there's 85 judicial vacancies today, and I expect that they will be able to fill all 85 of them in the next 2 years.
Yeah, they'll certainly give it a shot. That's for sure, and let's hope so. But anyway, so
the less the Senate has legislation to work on, the more time they have to do confirmation here.
Exactly. Well, I want to get to 2024 because we need to look forward already. But before we do, I just want to take a quick break, and then we will get right back and look to the future. So, Ken, this week, Donald Trump made official what, everyone already knew was coming, his candidacy for the presidency in 2024. And it seems to me that a lot of the Republican establishment is hoping they can move on from Trump by uniting behind Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, though I should point out that Trump still has, some pretty significant hold over an awful lot of Americans. And by the way, more than $100 million in his Save America Leadership PAC. And you might say, wait a second, that PAC can't directly contribute to Trump's campaign. You're right. But there are plenty of more or less legal ways for it to be transferred to third-party PACs or dark money organizations. The point being is there's a lot of money and a lot of support there. And in addition to DeSantis, I should point out, there are a number of other Republicans who are potential challengers to Trump. There's VP Mike Pence, just has a new book out. Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, and I don't know, I guess we could throw Ted Cruz into the mix. He would appreciate it, I'm sure. But it's obviously very early, and Trump is the only officially announced candidate. But weirdly, and in a bad way, this reminds me a lot of 2016. You had a Republican establishment. They were trying to clear the field by throwing their weight behind the popular Florida and kind of charisma challenged Florida governor, right, Jeb Bush. And I'm wondering, Ken, do you think the Trump magic is gone, or at least maybe minimized enough to keep him from the nomination in 2024, or what?
I don't know. I mean, I think we can rule out Pence already.
You think?
I think he's not going to be the nominee.
He'll sell some books, maybe.
Trump, yeah. And with Trump, you mentioned the $100 million war chest, but I have faith that he's going to try to grift a lot of that money and not actually spend it on his campaign. He'd much rather find ways to put that in his pocket. So I don't think all that's going into his campaign if he stays true to form. I think he has tremendous power to destroy other people's candidacies. I think he could block someone like a DeSantis from really moving forward and claiming the nomination. And I think that's really his main power, is destructive. Now, I guess what you were getting at with the 2016 analogy is if he manages to destroy all the others, then he's the last one standing. And yeah, I can't rule out that scenario, but I actually, I'd be fine with that scenario. I mean, that to me, all right, let him do it.
Yeah, you mean because you think that Trump is the most beatable of the likely Republican contenders for 2024?
Yeah, I mean, he's a proven 3-time loser now, right? He actually lost the 2016 popular vote, so he never had a majority of the country, but he did win that election. But then he lost the Congress big time in 2018. He lost the presidency in 2020. And I think most of the analytics that have been done this week say he cost the Republicans about 5 percentage points of the vote. That the particular candidates that he endorsed underperformed by about 5 points compared to where people thought Republicans might be in those states. And everybody, I think, is considering this election to be a bad result for the Republicans, even though, they did pick up the House. So it's not a miserable result for them. But I don't think Trump gets the credit for that. So, I think he just shows again and again that he keeps losing. And even with Republicans, his base gets more and more tarnished. And if he does destroy, if he destroys the political viability of some of his opponents to clear a path for himself, a DeSantis or a Youngkin or whoever, that's going to make it harder for him to unify what's left of the Republican Party, even compared to where we were in 18 or 20 or 22. So, yeah, I think he'd be almost absurdly easy to beat. And so it wouldn't bother me if it goes that direction. But I can't predict this far out.
I follow the logic, and we've been doing I've been doing this podcast since 2015, so I recall back to those days in 2016 where I felt like very eerily similar logic. I remember following the Republican primaries and say, you go Donald Trump, because I'm pretty sure that's the one candidate that Hillary Clinton's going to wipe the floor with. And I wasn't really thrilled with Hillary Clinton, but I'm like, yeah, she's weak, but he's just atrociously weak. And that's my concern, is that once you get to those final two, and you mentioned it earlier in the show, that we're so polarized that you can have a Herschel Walker who runs a neck and neck campaign with a Raphael Warnock, which blows my mind. Some Republicans are saying the same thing. You can have a Democrat who's clearly suffering the ill effects of a stroke and wins over a Republican. And so candidate quality, it doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot in a just about 50-50 country. I'm a little less sanguine about this than you are, I think.
Well, I see. I completely acknowledge the point you're making, but the thing I'd say against it is, why is this not the same as 2016? Well, we actually had Trump in the White House for 4 years, and a couple of the states that he won, Pennsylvania and Michigan in particular, I'd say, there's no chance that he could win those states again, and he has, because of his presidency, those states are blue states, and Fetterman was up by more than 10 points until he had the stroke, and he won even with the stroke. Yeah. And I think, and look, Whitman up in Michigan not only won by better than 60-40 in her gubernatorial reelection, but she turned the legislature blue. The whole Supreme Court's now blue. Those states are pushed so squarely into the blue camp that's all the significant change you really need to say that 2016 couldn't be repeated.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I also am concerned about some signs of Democratic weakness in the Southwest and some other states. But yeah, the numbers seem to me to suggest that what you were saying should happen. But I guess I've been burned once, and burned in an incredibly significant way. And so, very reluctant to go there. But, let's talk about the Democratic side as well. It seems that President Biden is intent on running for re-election, despite the fact that a significant percentage of voters have said they don't want him to run again. There was this New York Times Siena College poll from this summer. Almost 2/3 of Democrats wanted someone else to run in 2024. And even if, let's say, Joe Biden decided he wasn't going to run, it's not like there's a clear, really obvious successor. I mean, Vice President Harris doesn't seem particularly strong. People have been talking about California Governor Gavin Newsom, and he's no far left progressive, but I don't know if a California governor is the sort of candidate Democrats need to win in 2024. So it's not like there's a whole lot of strength on the Democratic side, I don't think. What do you think? Yeah,
I actually agree with that, and I think Biden should run again, partly for the reason that you just said. You have to think about, well, if not Biden, then who? And, Biden has uniquely managed to hold a kind of diverse Democratic coalition together. Most Democrats are still behind him. And, you could look at it and say, well, his public approval ratings haven't been that great. The Republicans have had all these years to bash him. He's not getting any younger, and his age could be an issue. And, all those things are true. But yet, nonetheless, he got elected. He defeated Trump. I think that most Democrats remain satisfied with his presidency. It was not a drag on these congressional elections, even though people thought it would be. So I think, really, if it ain't broke, why fix it would kind of be how I would look at this. I think it might be good for him to get Kamala Harris off the ticket. I think she has not helped herself in the 2 years she's been vice president so far. She has, no significant accomplishments of any sort, and maybe he needs to give her more space to have some if he wants her to stay his running mate. I mentioned a minute ago Gretchen Whitmer. I'd be pretty delighted if Gretchen Whitmer became his running mate instead of Kamala Harris. And I think she's just there's a lot more energy and excitement around her candidacies, and she really did take Michigan from being an extremely purple state to being a totally blue state.
Yeah, I think that I'd also like to see kind of a move from octogenarian leadership in the presidency as well. And Whitmer is someone who I think very, very highly of. And there are a few others as well. I mean, for years, I was a big fan of Pete Buttigieg, but I don't think he's very electable necessarily for some very unfortunate and bigoted reasons, I would hazard to guess. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I hope I am, but that's kind of my take on the presidential side. That Biden's the best of a kind of weak class as it stands right now, I think. But then there's this.
On Buttigieg. Can I say one thing?
Yeah,
please.
Buttigieg,
I feel like, I know exactly what you're saying about the bad and bigoted reasons, but it is interesting to me, and we're going to talk about this in a minute or two, that bipartisan coalitions in the House and the Senate have passed same-sex marriage bills. The House is going to have to vote again to reconcile it to the version that the Senate passed, but there's no doubt we're going to get a same-sex marriage bill that's going to be passed on a bipartisan basis within the next week or two. So the public may be changing on that issue. I actually think Buttigieg has a different problem if he wants to run, which is that he was Secretary of Transportation during the worst supply chain crisis in American history. And I think it's going to be easy to paint him as a failure, and that he's going to have to probably have some kind of successes before he's really ready to run again. But luckily he's young, and I think time is on his side, and that's also true on the issue of his sexual orientation as well, I think.
I'm kind of a sucker for technocratic elites, can write a good position paper, I guess. So anyway, but if we look at the Senate, prior to these midterms, I was envisioning a scenario where Republicans would potentially have a filibuster-proof Senate majority by 2025, thinking, okay, they'll maybe get the 52, 53 in 2022. And the map is incredibly favorable for 2024. Democrats are defending 23 seats to just 11 for Republicans. And I think, well, I could look at a map where they get the rest of the way there. Now, that seems a lot less likely to me now. We'll pick up a 10 to 11 seats. Hard for me to envision with that, even with that good Republican map. But also, I find it hard to see Democrats having a great chance of keeping control of the Senate past 2024. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
It's an uphill battle for sure. I don't think it's impossible. It will be a presidential year, so there'll be more turnout, more money, and I think those things will basically help the Dems. Here in Ohio, we have probably one of the most vulnerable seats with Sherrod Brown coming up for election in 24 in a state that's gone increasingly red. But there's been a few times before where it looked like Sherrod Brown couldn't keep his seat, and he always has. And I think one advantage that he has in Ohio that really can't be replicated by anybody else is, as the kind of white working class, non-college educated Ohio kind of switched parties from being Democrats to being Trump-type Republicans, J.D. Vance voters, these are all people that have always voted for Sherrod Brown. And I think it's just a lot easier for them to think of him as an exception because they've always voted for him before and they still like him. And that's not, Tim Ryan might be a very similar candidate to Sherrod Brown, but the one thing Tim Ryan didn't have going for him that Sherrod Brown always does is, they voted for him in the last. Sure. They voted for Brown in the last election. They voted for Brown in the election before that. They voted for Brown in the election before that. They like him, and so I think he has a possibility of hanging on. Montana similarly, like Tester's got to be another extremely endangered Democrat, but he's popular in Montana. It's a small state, and if national money goes in there, he'll be able to get his message out. And so I don't think it's impossible, but yeah, absolutely. I think if you're just saying what are the odds are that the Dems can't hold the Senate in 24. But the things, all kinds of things could change by then. Sure. And so I think it's too early to really say.
Now, are you going to make that same argument for Joe Manchin in West Virginia?
I think Manchin can win in West Virginia.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay. Sure. Wow. Yeah, I think he's toast. So we'll see about that. But yeah. Okay. Well,
didn't he win last time by better than 60% of the vote?
No, his last time his margins have been going down. I think the last time it was actually reasonably close. I'd have to check to be sure, but I would be stunned if Joe Manchin wins another term. But again, I'm certainly hoping you're right about that. That would be great for.
I would put him in the same category as I was putting Sherrod Brown, sure. Even more so. He's got a very high brand recognition, right? Like the West Virginians know Joe Manchin, and so I think that sort of eclipses a little bit the party affiliation stuff.
Yeah, well, I think to a bit, but probably not enough to overcome the other things. But we shall see in a few years. But you mentioned the same-sex marriage in relation to Pete Buttigieg, and this is what we were going to talk about. Congress is actually doing some bipartisan work here because this week the Senate 63-37 voted to overcome a filibuster on that Respect for Marriage Act. There were 12 Republicans who joined all 50 Democrats supporting it. And as you also mentioned, the House passed a similar measure this summer. It was 267, 157, 47 Republicans voting in favor. And what this would do would repeal the Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriage for federal purposes as a union of one man and one woman, and also allowed states to refuse to recognize same-sex marriage from other states. Now, with two Supreme Court holdings that came after that, United States versus Windsor in 2013 and Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, those effectively invalidated DOMA. But there are people on the left who are concerned that given the fact that there have been some significant changes on the court since then, and both of those were 5-4 decisions, and also given what Justice Thomas said in Dobbs about how prior rulings relying on substantive due process should be reconsidered, that, hey, now is the time to put in some federal legal protection in case states decide to go in this direction. I wanted to get your take specifically on whether you think this is just Democrats teeing up an issue that's going to be a tough vote for some Republicans, given the national mood on this, as you pointed out, very favorable, generally speaking, or do you think that there are real grounds for concern here?
Well, I think it's both.
Okay.
I think the politics of it alone make it worth doing. Not only the electoral politics, but the symbolism, the completely beneficial symbolism of a kind of statement of American values that we're for tolerance and equality, and it's nice for our elected officials to stand up for that. So I think there's a lot of reason to do it that are political on kind of low politics and high politics levels. I think the practical significance of it would be a little further down the road, which is to say, I don't think that the Supreme Court in 2023 is going to overrule Obergefell and Windsor. But I do think that beginning with Dobbs, the Supreme Court in 2023 is going to keep deciding additional cases after Dobbs that continue to weaken the foundation that underlies Obergefell and Windsor. And so I think if the court personnel never changes, or at least the majority bloc never changes, I think we're probably 5 years away from the overruling of Obergefell and Windsor. So I think in that sense, this legislation will serve a good prophylactic purpose. Yeah,
and I should point out that there are something like 25 states that have provisions in their state constitutions that actually include bans on same-sex marriage or similar unions that were invalidated by those Supreme Court decisions. And, maybe when we look at national trends here, pretty clearly this has been a sea change, right? Because DOMA was strong bipartisan majorities in the mid-'90s, signed into law by President Clinton, and there's been a huge change, absolutely for the better as far as I'm concerned. But so maybe this isn't a winning issue in, say, Wisconsin or Michigan, but you take a look at, there's polling in Mississippi and Arkansas, for instance, from just last year that suggests that there's still majority opposition to same-sex marriage. And I'm not saying that leads anywhere, but I don't think it's something that we can just dismiss as being completely performative, let's make Republicans have a bad vote sort of thing.
Yeah, that's the same thing I'm saying.
Yeah.
I think just like it took 50 years for the anti-choice movement to get Roe overruled, but they were working on it the whole time. I think that's the posture, that we have to think about with the Supreme Court on same-sex marriage, that there are people bringing cases that are laying foundations to get Obergefell and Windsor overruled. And they're going to win a lot of those cases. So, there's going to be, there's not going to be a full frontal attack on same-sex marriage next year, but there's going to be, kind of sideways attacks on it that come up in different contexts. And that does, the more the doctrinal underpinnings get weakened by other cases, the more it could fall later. So I think it's necessary. I also want to just say one thing about the bill itself that the Senate passed. I really like it. There's one thing about it that is different than the House bill, and it's why the House is going to have to revote. And it seems like it's weaker than the House bill, but I think it's actually stronger.
Okay.
So the House bill would have more or less codified Obergefell and said, same-sex marriage is illegal everywhere. And I'm sorry, same-sex marriage is legal everywhere. Yeah. Every state has to celebrate it. The bans on it are the state bans are preempted by federal law. The Senate version it looks weaker because it says states can decide for themselves whether they want to allow or not allow same-sex marriage to be celebrated. And those states that have these state constitutional rules that say there's no same-sex marriage in this state, those would sort of spring back into effect in a way because it wouldn't be possible to get a same-sex marriage in that state. But then the bill says, but if anyone gets a same-sex marriage in any state where it is legal, that still has to be recognized in all 50 states. Now, that does mean, people who live in Mississippi, they may have to, travel, up to take a trip up to New York or something to get married. But then when they go back to Mississippi, they're still married. And the reason I like that better is I think it's as a practical matter, it's equally effective. And as a legal matter, it's more bulletproof in terms of current Supreme Court doctrines because the House bill depended on the reading of the Equal Protection Clause that the Supreme Court adopted in Obergefell and Windsor. And if the court overruled those cases, then they could overrule the House version of the bill. Right. Whereas the Senate bill depends only on the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, which gives Congress the enumerated power to set rules by which states must give full faith and credit to legal acts of other states. Right. And so it doesn't require any use of equal protection principles or anything like that. It's just dictating to the states that this is a legal act in one state that you must give full faith and credit to. And I think even Clarence Thomas, I think, would not vote to overrule that. And so I think that makes it just much more judicially bulletproof.
Though it would potentially impose a real world burden on some people who couldn't just go down to their county courthouse and get married. They'd have to go to another state.
Yeah, I think it would impose that burden. That's not to say the other state couldn't have Zoom marriages like that.
Just have some certain residency or non-residency requirements. Just kind of work that out so that they could make that happen. Sure. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, Nevada doesn't have any residency requirements for marriage already, right? Yeah. I think a state could make under its own state law. There's no residency requirement for marriage, and there's no physical presence in the state requirement for marriage. You could just zoom into a wedding chapel and get married by the wedding chapel that's in that state, and that would have to be recognized under this statute. So I don't think it imposes severe inconveniences, but I think the benefit of it is it makes it an easier vote for these Republicans, which keeps it bipartisan, and it makes it more bulletproof in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, good point. All right. Well, I think we have time for one more story, and why don't we kind of move overseas at least a little bit? The group of 20, the G20 nations, met this week in Bali, Indonesia, and that gave President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping a chance to meet. Well, they've met before, but this is the first time they've met as national leaders. They've known each other for like a decade or more. And I think both Biden and Xi attempted to sort of dial down the tension between their countries, at least in some way. I mean, Xi said China has never sought to alter the current international order, does not meddle in the American domestic politics, and has no intention of challenging and replacing the United States. Biden says, I absolutely believe there need not be a new Cold War, and he didn't believe that there was an imminent Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But he did add, I'm not saying this is kumbaya, and Xi reportedly told Biden that Taiwan is a red line issue for that the U.S. should definitely not cross. So I'm wondering, Ken, do you think this is just sort of typical diplomatic speak, or do you think this meeting between Biden and Xi mattered in some sort of substantive way?
I'm afraid it's just typical diplomatic speak. I mean, my concern really is the Taiwan issue more than the others. But sure. I think things have, China is getting increasingly aggressive towards Taiwan. And I think, there's this situation now where both the U.S. and China, I think, are deeply concerned that we don't want a hot war between the U.S. and China. But China seems like it's willing to keep trying to, just push the envelope a little bit farther into what kind of incursions against Taiwan it's going to make. And this is following, a fairly successful campaign that they had to end democracy in Hong Kong. And again, just through slow and steady means and mainly non-military means, but a little bit of flexing of military muscle. And I think it would be not acceptable to me, I would say, to see Taiwan go the way that Hong Kong seems to have gone, where it becomes completely subsumed within China and loses the democracy that it's enjoyed. And I don't know that this really pushed the ball forward on that. I think the kind of words that both sides used, make me think that China is going to keep pursuing the courses of action it's been pursuing, which are really like pushing a little bit more against Taiwanese democracy. And seemingly both sides saying, well, we can't have a military war over that, but the U.S. not really being that clear about what we can do about. I mean, I guess we have some sanctions against the semiconductors and things like that, but I don't know where that's all headed. It alarmed me a bit.
Yeah, because I mean, those sanctions, I mean, Donald Trump in his announcement speech talked about how tough he was and so forth. But those Biden very targeted technology sanctions, those I would argue, and a lot of people would argue, are much tougher than anything Donald Trump did against China. And in response, I think in part to, those very real concerns about Taiwan. But I don't know. I wonder about that language, because so Biden says an invasion isn't imminent, right? That's
Yeah.
Does that mean like, well, in a year or two? And so I guess I'm wondering, what's your take? Do you see this as being something that's maybe inevitable is too strong of a word, but do you think at some point in the, next few years, do you see China as doing something much more than just aggressive actions, but actually taking like a substantive kind of action to take over Taiwan in some way?
Yeah, I do see that. I mean, I don't think it will look exactly like what Russia's doing in Ukraine. I don't think China wants to roll in there, with tanks and start shooting up the island. And they didn't do that in Hong Kong, right? But in Hong Kong, they managed to completely supplant the old system and violate the treaties with the UK that had sort of guaranteed a certain level of Hong Kong independence for a period of time, just through a series of slow shows of force without a whole ton of actual uses of force. And I think we will see more and more of that. I mean, there's some of the shows of force against Taiwan we've already seen include like shooting missiles right over the across the skies of Taiwan, sure, and things like that. And I think we're going to just see more and more of that. I don't think China is thinking of backing away from that. I think they're accelerating that. But I don't know quite if even they have an end game of, how do they keep accelerating that? What's the next step? But I think patience. I think they have a lot of patience. Yeah. And so I think to just kind of keep things going in the direction they've been going and continually slowly ratcheting up the pressure seems to me like a plan that they can execute for a while.
Yeah, I mean, they obviously had certain advantages in Hong Kong, big advantages that they don't have in Taiwan. They don't have any kind of even quasi-legal authority there. And so that makes it much more challenging. And I agree with you that I can't picture them ever ratcheting down the pressure, but I think it gets to a point where they say, well, we've done what we can short of actual physical force, and that's kind of where it stays, I think. And so I guess I may be both more and less optimistic. I think that maybe something will happen, a significant change. But if it is, I think it's going to have to actually be some sort of a military incursion. And my hope is that the Chinese are too concerned about the enormous uncertainty and stability, world stability ramifications of that sort of thing to take that step anytime soon. So that's kind of my prediction there.
Well, there's things like cyber attacks.
Yeah, that's
things
true.
Like attacks on the financial system. Could be blockades of shipping or efforts to get China's whole sphere of influence to not do any trade with Taiwan. So I think there's a lot more ways they can keep ratcheting up pressure. And even under our own one China policy, it's ambiguous, right, about whether China has authority there, because although part of our policy is that we say that the status quo should be maintained and that there should be peace has to be maintained in the across the Straits of Taiwan. we do actually, the U.S. recognizes the ultimate sovereignty of the People's Republic of China over Taiwan. So that does give them a bit of a legal leg to stand on, although, of course, you're right that it's not as strong of a legal leg as they had in Hong Kong, but it's something that they can build on.
Yeah, no, those are good points. Absolutely. So I think I don't expect to see anything happen, any drastic like that anytime soon. Just with all the other uncertainty in the world, I would be surprised if China decided to just sort of, throw the equivalent of an H bomb in the toilet cherry bomb in the toilet and walk away. Not an H bomb, thank God. That would destroy a toilet. But anyway, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But I don't see China backing down, and I don't see Taiwan backing down. And how does this end? Well, that's an excellent and disturbing question, I think. So, yeah.
One other thing on the G20 and China, one other thing I thought was interesting or worth noting, and interested in your thoughts on it. The G20 did issue a statement about the Ukraine war, and the statement on the Ukraine war, basically said, war is unacceptable and there should be peace and stability. But then it also said something along the lines of, not all members of the G20 agree.
Yeah.
And so I was just trying to make sense of what to make of that. It was I found that very difficult to parse, and maybe you could say, well, China was bending very slightly in our direction by even allowing this statement to go out at all, because they probably could have blockaded it or dissented from it. But then, on the other hand, the statement goes out and sort of says they really don't agree with it, and so I don't know. I don't know what to make of that. I wonder if you had thoughts on that.
Well, I had kind of a similar reaction. I read some of the headlines saying Russia increasingly isolated after G20 statement. I was like, oh, that sounds good. Okay. And I did the same thing you did. I pulled up the statement and I was like, okay, I'm not seeing that. Yeah, exactly. No, I thought it was bland even by the standards of one of those international organizations. Statement: war is bad and we're against it. Okay, that's it was pretty weak stuff, I thought. So I had the similar reaction to you. I didn't see this as being. I guess you can argue, like you said, that okay, China at least allowed it to go out, but that's really kind of grasping at straws, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they allowed it to go out, noting that there was a diversity
exactly.
within the G20.
Yeah, exactly. So, whatever. Yeah. But hey, before we go, one of my favorite things about shows you do with Trey is, well, that shouldn't be the favorite thing is the non-political thing at the end, right? But I love all of them, but I always enjoy your recommendations, and so I wanted to get one of those in before we end the show today.
Well, Michael, this one comes not only as a recommendation to the listeners, but as an invitation to you. My recommendation this week is for a book that is written by a friend of mine, but he's a extremely good writer. His name is R.J. Smith. He used to write for Cincinnati Magazine here in Cincinnati. He's since moved to Los Angeles. But he wrote the best biography ever of the musician James Brown. And now, just last week, he published another biography, and this one is of Chuck Berry. And it's called Chuck Berry, An American Life by R.J. Smith. And it just came out. I'm only about halfway through it, but I'm absolutely loving it. And R.J. Smith will be here in town in Cincinnati tomorrow, Saturday, at Joseph Beth Books at 11 a.m. doing a book talk for the book and signing books. And I plan to be there, and I've invited you to come there as well, Michael.
Oh, very cool. I am a big Chuck Berry fan, and that sounds like a fantastic read and a great event. It's going on my list, that is for sure. All right. Well, with that, we will actually, before we do close the show, I want to thank a few new supporters. Bob on Patreon, Bob, and also Florida Rep. Thank you guys so much. We really do appreciate your support of the show. And if you're not already a supporter, we hope you'll consider becoming one, because without you guys, we just couldn't keep doing this week after week. And also, not just our thanks, but when you become a supporter, you get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out, our supporter-exclusive midweek show, and there's other stuff at other levels of support. Check it all out. Go to patreon.com/politicsguys. And if you want to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. There's PayPal as well. You can find all the support links in the show notes every week, as well as at politicsguys.com. patreon.com/support. And if you'd like to get that midweek show I mentioned, but you're not in a financial position to support the show right now, totally not a problem. Shoot me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you all set up with that. And of course, whether you're a supporter or not, it definitely helps us, and it doesn't cost anything if you will subscribe, rate, and review the show on whatever podcast app you happen to be using, and share episodes on social media. And finally, a special thanks, as always, to our fantastic executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.